Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of a conversation with series by the European Economics Association. And today we have with us Dr. Ramin Nassehi from the UCL Economics Department. So, Dr. Ramin Nassehi, thank you so much for joining us today. If you could just start off by briefly introducing yourself, maybe the courses you teach, some of your research interests, and a fun fact about yourself.
Hi, I'm Ramin. I'm a lecturer at UCL. I'm part of the CTEL, Center for Teaching and Learning Economics, and I teach three courses. And interestingly, they're very different sizes, and this is very relevant to our subsequent conversation. So I teach a very large course in my first year on the world economy, it's international economics, and the size of it is 450. Then I teach economic history to second and third years. The size of it is 60. Then in the third year, I teach dissertation, and the size of it is about 20. So I have these monster cohorts of 400, mid-size 60, and the small size. Uh, Fun fact about me, sometimes when I'm going to do a very important lecture or talk, I listen to music beforehand, and usually it's Eminem, Lose Yourself.
That's great.
Yeah.
So, moving on to our discussion. So, of course, like this year, due to the current circumstances and the pandemic, most of the teaching had to take place virtually. So we just wanted to know as to how did you adapt your teaching methods to the online environment, and what were some of the sort of key advantages and disadvantages of this new format?
So let me start with the course design itself, the syllabus. Of course, as most lecturers, I reduce the content
Yeah.
because I started to think about it more carefully and more critically. Now that I had to produce a lot of recorded material, I was forced to think more carefully about the content, what to cover and what not to cover. So first thing, I reduced the content. The second one was how would I make sure that students would stay engaged throughout the process? Because this time I didn't have them physically in the campus. And so I used assessment for that. So usually the assessments are lumped at the end of the semester, but this time I broke them down into different parts and I spread them throughout the term to make sure that the students stay engaged. Of course, the downside of it was for me a lot of marking and administrative issues, but also for the students. I imagine other courses doing the same thing, and I think we ended up over assessing students at the aggregate level. Now, so this was the syllabus design. In terms of lecturing itself, so of course, I switched to flip learning. I recorded some videos beforehand. Then I complemented those pre-recorded stuff with a live discussion in my live lectures. And this was the overall strategy of putting things together. I can talk about more specifically what I used in my live session later on, if you wish.
And just a small extension to that. So, is there anything from this online setting which you would like to continue even when lectures become in person again?
Oh, absolutely. The things that I'm going to keep is the flip learning that I'm going to keep. Virtual office hours that I'm going to keep because I found them. A lot of people can join, and it's much more efficient and much more fruitful. What are the other things that I'm going to keep from this setting? Um, I would, if possible, I would prefer to keep some of my tutorials virtual because I found, maybe I can explain this later on. I found it much more fruitful to have small scale virtual tutorials because there is a whole range of activities that you can do. The breakout rooms that you can give them tasks and if that possible, so I'll keep the tutorials online as well.
Great. And now moving on to like some of the tasks, some of the activities which we've been seeing you do all across. So of course we've seen you record and post engaging and interactive videos for the core economics module for first year students. Could you walk us through some of the important things to keep in mind while preparing such materials? And what advice would you give to others in this field who are trying to do something similar?
So the your question again, going back to the pre-recorded material, and I was, as you said, asked to pre-record specifically the models in the core econ module. Now, my first advice for people who want to record videos, just get it out. Don't try to perfect it. You know, when I go back and see my initial videos, I hate them. The voice is bad, the editing is bad, but the trick is to just get them out. Avoid perfectionism. Just get it out, whatever you have, the first, second draft. And then it's a learning process. As you produce more of them, you learn. So that's my first practical advice. But what was really different about these videos? Because technically, if you look at it, there are gazillions of videos already recorded on YouTube. Why record another set of material, let's say on Keynesian cross? There are loads of videos out there. Now, what was new about my approach? For instance, when people want to talk about Keynesian cross, or Keynesian economics in one unit, they do different bits of it. The first part, they introduce a podcast to make people motivated about the bigger context. Who was Keynes? What was this idea important? They do a separate video on the cross itself. It's very dry, just a model, nothing else. And then they try to link it to an example today, our Keynesian policies during the COVID. So usually these are three separate components. But I try to combine all these things in my model. So even when I want to explain the cross, I combine the motivation, the model, and the example at the same time. So I edit footages in them of real world example. I edit footages in even within the models. I introduce characters in them. So I try to introduce this holistic approach to explaining models.
Yeah, that sounds great. And of course, like the next one is all about role plays in economic modules. And how do you think can role play be used effectively in economics, either online or in person?
Mhm.
Why do you use it, and what's the thinking behind it?
So I think I would use role play for two different kinds of material. First one is macroeconomics, because usually if you want to explain something that emerges at the aggregate level or emerges out of the interaction of many people, role play is very useful in that context. Role play is very useful. Role play, actually, people see the aggregation, the students see the aggregation in action. So let me give you an example. For instance, again, when I want to explain the Keynesian, paradox of thrift, someone's spending is another person's income. I use role play. So I divide the students into households, into banks, into businesses, and then I start a game. I'll say, imagine you have a panic. How would you react? And so that is very useful for the macroeconomic, for explaining macroeconomic phenomena. The other thing that is quite useful is for game theory, where you have interaction again. I'm thinking Shivam is going to do that at the same time. Shivam is thinking that I'm going to do that, and then I use a role play. Or some tutors use experiments, experimental methods. But you can also use role plays because the students can explicitly talk about their reasonings.
That's great. And like, of course, some of your most popular initiatives, such as the Econ Frame and the UCL Economics Walk, could you maybe describe them in a few words as to what they are and the motivations behind them?
So let me explain them separately. First of all, let's start with Econ Frame. So Econ Frame is a photo competition for economics. What's the idea about it is that we encounter abstract economic theories in our everyday lives. You know, a lot of examples around us. And the idea is to encourage students to capture a photo of their everyday life that captures an economic concept. And the idea popped into my mind when I was walking one day, when I was walking to the department. When I was walking to the department, I was in the sidewalk and I saw one of these rental bikes blocking the sidewalk. And then an economic concept popped into my mind: negative externalities, you know, that the bike company is better off because someone has hired the bike. And also the customer is better off because they got into their destination, but they're blocking the road for the rest of the society. So this was a good example of negative externality. So I took a picture of it, captured it in my everyday life. And I thought that why not just extend it? You know, ask the students to do the same thing. So there is a big research element into it, encouraging students to connect economic theories to their everyday life. That's the first thing. The second thing is more about connecting economics to humanities, to arts and humanities, of encouraging economic students to be more creative in communication and expressing the ideas. So if you look at the way we present, economists are becoming more and more homogeneous in their presentation. And I would say more and more distance from way, you know, people in arts and humanities present. And I think reducing that gap can help. And this is one of those things that a photo competition, UCL Econ Frame, does. So that was this. I do another thing called UCL Economics Walk. So this started, I'm going to talk about the face-to-face version of it. The face-to-face version of it, the pre-COVID word, I used to give this tour as a walking tour, like all other history tours you go around in London. You know, there was a group of people and I was a tour leader and we walked around London and we talked about places that have an economic story to tell. We visited Keynes' house, for instance. And what was a new thing about this is that, first of all, it was more interactive. So we played games, we discussed things. It wasn't me just sitting in, you know, and trying to transfer some information to the tour, to the group, so that they can learn about history of Keynes' house. No, that was not the case. So it was more of an interactive, more dialogue-based conversation between me and the group. So that was the thing. Now, then the pandemic happened. I had to make all these things virtual. So I started to use Google Map and I started to use green screen. I started to move myself around the Google map and trying to recreate a virtual experience of space, but doing the same thing, doing it more interactive, you know, doing the tour more interactive, or use other elements, play more music in my tour. If I happen to be get to a character, let's say, Charles Dickens' house, and I, play dialogue of one of his plays, at that stop. So multimedia and more interaction in the online version. And why? Let's take a big picture. What's the new thing about this? Why not just sit in a lecture hall and talk about these things? Why do a walking tour, real one or virtual one? The good thing about it is that this is a place-based method of talking about economics, a location-based method about talking about economics. And this is very kind of intuitive. When you go out, when you just focus on one location and then try to use that location as a case study, to communicate economics, that's very useful. You don't, final bit, you don't need to live in a historical city to do that. You can just use your, I don't know, Tesco branch as a location to talk about economics and communicate or teach a lot about economics to the non-experts.
Yeah, and like I think one of the last questions which we'll have is that with regards to the technologies, I mean, like how has your experience been using, the new technologies which have completely shot up, like Zoom and Teams, and to all those sort of teaching fellows, professors who have recently entered the teaching stream, how would you recommend them using these technologies efficiently?
Okay, very, very good question. These technologies make interaction actually stronger on some aspects. And I'll give you an example if you wait for a moment. One of the things, let me talk about how did I started to use technology to make people engaged in the virtual sessions. The very first step was trying to ask people to open up their cameras. And this has been a difficulty for many of our lectures. But I come up with my own method of doing that. And that was the following. So I open up my own camera. Everyone else's camera is closed. But I ask students that after 2 minutes, I'm going to ask everyone to open up their cameras on my count of three, to open up their cameras at the same time. Now, this solves the coordination problem because none of the students wants to be the first one opening up their camera, exposing him or herself while the others' cameras are closed. So if you ask people to open up their cameras at the same time, you get a higher success rate. So that was the first step. If a lot of people open up their camera, you create that collective sense. You create that collective sense. You can use the same thing on chat. You ask a question and you ask the students to put their answers in the chat, but you ask them to put their answers after 1 minute, at the same time on your count of three. Again, this makes sure that you break that barrier. Suddenly, if you do this, your chat room becomes alive. And these are the techniques. So usually you need to break the ice. And if you do it in one or two of your sessions, from the third session, it becomes almost automatic. Once you do these techniques, for my regular interaction in the live session, I use every Mentimeter or Poll Everywhere, especially for the courses that are 400, because only polling works for that size, a class of 400. So I use polling. And in combination of that, for instance, I say, do you think free trade is good or bad? And 200 people say it's good and 200 people say it's bad. And then I ask students, to raise their hands and comment on it. But I always start from the big picture, the big poll. So polling is another technique as well. And I wanted to talk about one final thing. Sometimes, so when you're online, polling is actually very useful and sometimes even more interactive. When I'm online, I actually do more polls in more systematic way. And sometimes showing objects, when I show you this book, this is one of those things. You can show objects. You're in your house teaching, so you have a lot of interesting objects, around you. So you can also use this into your advantage. For instance, for my economic history course, I ask students, I give them 2 minutes, and I ask them to go and find the technology, the most important technology that is very welfare improving in their house. I couldn't do this in the face-to-face setting. I asked them to go find that technology. Most of them bring light bulb for good reasons and show it in front of the camera. So these are the things that actually, the type of interactions that actually is now available for us through this new medium of Zoom, for instance.
Thank you so much for those insights. And I think it was really helpful for all of us to get to know about more of these teaching methods and interactive learning. And to all our viewers, thank you so much for watching. And I really hope that you enjoy watching this video.